Sigma salute. I'm Lord Maitreya, the hip hop futurist. You're now tuned into the Superlongevity Institute podcast. This evening at the Institute, I have a very special guest. He is a Franco-American cognitive scientist, public speaker, author, and professor at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, where he holds a dual appointment in psychology department in the Center for Cognitive Science. Born and raised in France, he studied at the University of Geneva in the neighboring Switzerland, the University of New Wales, Bangor in the United Kingdom, and the University of Maryland and the University of Pennsylvania. The goal of his work is to promote the role, understanding, and importance of science, reason, and critical thinking. He is the author of Soul Fallacy, what science shows we gain from letting go of our soul beliefs. Ladies and gentlemen, hip-hop futurist, transhumanists worldwide, Dr. Julien Musolino. Welcome to the Institute. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight.
I have a couple of questions prepared for us, but I put it on my phone, so I'm just going to go in my phone real quick. Here we go.
Sounds good.
Okay. One of the questions I wanted to ask you, because I read your book and it changed my life. It was very masterfully done, very easy to read, and I enjoyed it. I read it a couple of times. I even shared it with a bunch of my friends and had a bunch of discussions on it. So you did a great job, and I'm glad to be able to thank you personally as a hip hopper and as a person who's interested in science, and as a lay person. I just wanted to thank you, and thank you for coming on. Did you have any when you was coming up? Did you come from a religious background? I know France is very secular.
Not really. I mean, Catholicism was in the background, but it was not very prominent. I can't say I grew up religiously. I did attend. It was on Wednesday in France, catechism. That didn't last very long. I was, I think, too inquisitive. I asked too many uncomfortable questions, and I didn't quite like the answers I was getting. So I can tell you a story if you're interested. But
definitely interested.
I gotta give up on that, and then. No, I can't say that religion played any role in my life, really. Yeah.
Wow. How did you get into? All right. How did you become a what gave you what? Why did you want to become a cognitive scientist? Like what was the motivation behind that life path?
You know, as much as I'd like to tell you a wonderful story about how I always knew when I was 5 that I wanted to do this and that, that's not true. I think, as is the case perhaps for many people, it's circumstances that shaped what happened to me. And so a story I like to tell, which is true, is that I ended up leaving France and Europe to come to the United States because a woman saw a poster on a wall. And then, so let me explain what I mean by this. At the time in the mid-1990s, I was an undergraduate student at the University of Geneva in Switzerland. And I had an advisor who was a wonderful lady. And I was reasonably good at it. And said, look, I'm applying for some funds from the Swiss government. And if I get those funds, then you can do a PhD with me. I'll fund you and everything. And I really liked the idea. But of course, she didn't get the money. And I was, at the time, I had gotten a European scholarship to go study in Wales in a master's program. So I was there. And it was the beginning of email at the time, 1993. So I got an email from her saying, I'm so sorry I didn't get the money. So there's nothing for you in Switzerland after you graduate. But she said, and here's the poster on the wall story. In the department where she worked, academic department, there was a poster on the wall that advertised for positions at the University of Maryland to do graduate work and a PhD. And she said to me, look, you should reach out to these people because they have money and so on and so forth. And so I reached out to them. It's the only graduate program that I applied to. At the time, I had no idea how to even do that. And luck got involved, and I got accepted. But so you see, if she hadn't seen that poster and hadn't told me about it, I would not have applied.
Right.
So it was not part of some masterful plan on my part. It's just
Wow.
it happened like that. And I moved to the U.S. and started my graduate work.
Mm,
And then standard story, after my PhD, I did what's called a postdoc, which is more research at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And then I became a professor at Indiana University, and then I moved to Rutgers. So pretty much
mm,
a standard academic career from that point forward.
mm. Can you tell my audience who may not know what a cognitive scientist is and what a cognitive scientist does? Because I don't really know one
Sure.
behind.
Yeah. So cognitive science is a field that developed or that sort of emerged in roughly the 1970s, and it's composed of different disciplines. So philosophy, linguistics, psychology, neuroscience, maybe computer science, possibly engineering, and all these fields are trying to understand uh, the mind or mental level phenomena, intelligence, whether it be in people,
Mm,
so human intelligence, or in animals,
mm,
animal intelligence, or even artificial intelligence, right? So intelligence broadly defined. And because the problems are so complex, it takes people from different disciplines with different kinds of training to mount a global effort to try to understand and shed light on these phenomena. So that's what
yes.
this is. If you're a cognitive scientist, you're trying to understand, roughly speaking, how the mind works. And that's what I do for a living. So I have a lab. I co-direct a lab at Rutgers with a team of people, and we do standard scientific research, experimentation. We try to find out how certain aspects of the mind, so it can be our capacity for language, or the memory system, or our ability to reason, or our ability to pay attention, our
Mm,
ability to make decisions, for example, how these
mm,
things work. And to do that, we apply the tools of rational inquiry and science broadly defined. So we try to build models. Sometimes they're mathematical models of what's going on, just like in other sciences. And then we test the predictions of these models against data that we collect very often experiments with people.
wow. That's very important work. Um, your book, The Soul is a Fallacy, What Science Shows We Gain from Letting Go of Our Soul, but it's a very controversial book. What what is the origins of the soul? How far back? Because it seems like it's just. I feel like when you read about science and all the battles that scientists had to go through and all of the prosecution that scientists had to go through in the past, particularly with the Catholic Church, as far as I remember being taught in school that when they said the sun is the center of the universe, our universe, that was a big upset, and it caused us to rethink our place in the universe and ourselves. And to me, the idea that we don't have a soul is on even a more another level, because and I feel that way because we've had this idea of the soul for so long. So how back does the belief of the soul go?
Yeah, you asked a very good point. You raised this idea that we've had some kind of soul goes back. So certainly it goes back to the beginning of recorded history. So certainly you find that in the Greek thinkers. So Plato was perhaps the first well-known dualist
Mm,
in the West. But even before Plato, the ancient Egyptians have notions of the soul. I mean, the notions differed a little bit, but same idea there, that there's some non-physical component to a person in contrast to the physical body. And there are good reasons to think that the ideas go back even further. Now, of course, prior to recorded history, it's a little harder to know what people were thinking.
mm,
But it's quite likely that once we became, as a species, once we became what's called cognitively behaviorally modern, language, and so on and so forth. We don't quite know exactly when that is, but tens of thousands of years ago, perhaps 100,000 years ago, 70,000 years ago, it's quite likely that these notions were present back then. Although, of course, we don't have any evidence for that. But yeah, it's very, very, there's a very long history. Incidentally, the alternative to the soul, namely the idea that it's just the body, and that the mind, including consciousness, is some kind of property of the body and not separate from the body, also has a long history. It's not, it didn't emerge in after the scientific revolution or anything like that. So in ancient Greece, you already had what are called the materialists, people who I'll give you one of the names is Democritus. He was a thinker at the time who was the origins, but the origins of the notion of atoms. So, tiny fundamental particles of matter. Of course, back then he didn't have any instrumentation, any mathematical theory or anything like that, but he reasoned that there had to be indivisible constituents of matter that he called atomos, or atoms. And so, and to him, everything in the universe was made up of that, including, so mental phenomena for him were sort of a manifestation of these atoms, right? Wow. So he had, there were different, just don't worry, it's something that fell on my desk. Yeah, I hope it didn't.
No, it's so good.
Okay. And so, yeah, so both of the ideas go way back, and they've had different prevalences in different historical times, but they're old ideas. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought that up because, this and showing that just like the belief, the soul beliefs, there was an opposite idea that of that belief. I'm glad you mentioned that, and that goes further back before the scientific revolution, which is a very interesting. The fact that he thought about that before the scientific revolution is amazing. First off, let's start there. There ain't no microscopes. There was nothing to test to even see the atom. So it was really, he must have been a really good critical thinker of that time. Can we go over what we mean by the idea of the soul? Because people there's so many definitions of the soul, but in your book, I want to make it clear to our audience what we mean by the soul in this discussion.
Yes, I think you're right. It's very important to be clear about what we mean so that we can move forward and not get bogged down in sort of semantic ambiguity. So I think one could mean quite a range of things when one talks about the soul, right? And I'll tell you in just a second what I mean in the book, but from very traditional conceptions of my soul, the thing that's going to carry my consciousness into the afterlife, all the way to some metaphorical notion of these poor souls in America, were taken over by COVID and 500,000 of them died. Okay, when you talk about a poor soul, now you're using the word metaphorically. But in the book, I tackle the notion that has been held, as we discussed for a long, long time, that most people today in the US, 70-80% of the population, roughly, according to surveys, and many, many more around the world believe in. And it's the idea that we human beings are not just physical creatures. We're not just our bodies and brains, but some other ingredients to the makeup of a human being, some non-physical or immaterial or spiritual part. And so you can find out what people think about this because you can ask them. You can ask them through surveys and everything. And there's also a literature, not a scientific literature, but there are people who are often they're religious apologists who write books to say, look, we do have a soul and here's why and here's how we know. And there's quite a few of them. So in most people's minds, the soul has the soul that they believe in, to the extent they believe in the soul, has three key properties. One is they'll tell you, look, my soul is immaterial or non-physical, so not like the stuff that we're made up of. Number one. Number two, they will tell you that their soul somehow contributes to their psychological functioning. They don't quite say it that way, but that's what they mean. They will say things like, my soul is the moral compass, the ability to make decisions, maybe the ability to fall in love, my consciousness, free will, which are psychological traits. And of course, the third property, which is very important, is the immortality of the soul. So that the belief is that once the physical body dies, ceases to function, then the soul is the vehicle that can carry your consciousness into the afterlife, where you can recognize Uncle Fred in heaven and be reunited with your loved ones and so on and so forth. So that's the soul that my book is about, to be clear.
Thank you for explaining that, by the way. Another thing I think that I would like to make a clarification on is I know this seems like a silly question, but it's, the distinction between the mind and the brain needs to be, I think, explained too before we go any further, because I want to be very clear, because this is a very touchy subject and I want to reach a lot of people.
Yeah, you ask a very good question. So in professional circles today, so cognitive science, neuroscience, to a large extent philosophy, the mind isn't a thing. It's an abstraction. So in other words, I'll give you an analogy. The mind is simply a way of talking about the brain at some level of abstraction. So that might seem complicated to people who are not involved in this kind of work, but a simple analogy will suffice. Suppose most of us have passports, right? Okay. So I have a passport. In fact, I have two passports because I grew up somewhere else. You have a passport, right? So your passport, by analogy, would kind of be like your physical body, right? So your passport, you can touch it, you can see it, or you can create a passport. Now think of the notion of nationality, your nationality. Now your nationality is some kind of abstract concept, right? It's related to your passport for sure, right? Because it's determined by your passport. Your passport says, I'm an American, right? And so your nationality is simply another way to talk about what's on your passport, right? And it's abstract. And so now you might ask, or people might ask, why do you guys in the sciences postulate the existence of this abstract level? Well, it's simply because it helps explain things. Scientists usually don't make things up just for the sake of it. They invoke certain concepts because these concepts, they try to show, can shed light on important phenomena. So if, for example, you're interested in trying to understand how language works, memory works, how decision-making works, or how attention works, then you have to invoke concepts at a level that's higher than simply neurons and hormones and chemicals in the brain. And at that level, you try to show that, of course, the concepts can get technical, right? You can say, I mean, I won't go into the details, but that level of abstraction is there to try to shed light on a number of phenomena. And this is, this is true in the sciences in general, right? So an analogy I often use is, if you're playing chess, right, and you're trying to understand what either the computer or the other person is doing, somebody might say, look, the chess set that you have there is a physical object, and it's made up of atoms and fundamental particles. And so let's go to fundamental physics, try to understand what's going on. But nobody would do that because it would be hopeless. Right. I mean, the idea would be, how could we try to understand why somebody moves the bishop by invoking a quantum field theory? That's hopeless. Right. So we don't invoke concepts at that level, like, spin and, whatever particle physicists postulate. But instead, we invoke everyday concepts, the things that we see in our level, right? We see things like bishops, so we call them bishops, and we call them rooks, and we call them queen, the king, even though those things are really pieces of matter that are made up underlyingly of fundamental particles. to describe and explain what's going on during a chess game, you don't switch to the low-level physical explanation, because that doesn't yield much in terms of explanation. Right? And so that's why you have these different levels. That's why you have fundamental physics, and then you go up a little bit, you have chemistry, and then you have biology, and then you have psychology, and so on and so forth.
Wow. Wow. Thanks for explaining that. Where do I start this? What evidence does different science fields say about the belief of the soul? Like, what are this like? What are some of the things that you can like the different studies? I mean, I guess it would have to be because all right. Let me go back a little because
Sure.
because most. I know I heard this a lot that scientists cannot make the claim that there's not a soul because the soul is immaterial. What do you have to What do you have to say for people who feel that way? Because I think the belief in the soul is a scientific claim like anything else to me.
Yes, I think that's the line of reasoning. It doesn't matter what people call it. You can call it material, immaterial, whatever you want. What matters is the nature of the claim. What are they saying exactly, right? So essentially, when you claim that there is a soul, first of all, it's not up to science to disprove it.
Right.
There's something called the burden of proof, which is if you make a claim, well, then to be taken seriously, you have to show some kind of evidence.
Right.
Of course, if the claim is trivial, then you don't need much evidence, right? If I tell you, for example, this morning I used my cell phone to call a friend in California, it doesn't really stretch the imagination that I was able to do that. Okay, possibly true unless I'm lying. But if I tell you this morning I was meditating, and after about 5 minutes I'm surrounded by blue light and I start levitating, well, okay, that's a claim that I make. And if I then look at people and say, well, go ahead, try to disprove that, science can disprove it, this is not good reasoning. Because the problem with this line of reasoning is that there's an infinite number of things, many of them are very silly, that science hasn't disproved, the tooth fairy and so on and so forth. And simply because science hasn't disproved it, doesn't give you license to believe it.
Right.
And so the way science and scientific and critical thinking work is that if somebody makes a claim, and if the claim is surprising, then the onus is on them to say, well, here's the claim, yeah, it's surprising, but here's the evidence, right? So in the case of the soul, then the question is, well, what's the evidence, right? And people, again, can scream until they're blue in the face, yeah, it's material. It doesn't matter, because the soul that most people have in mind, think about, has consequences for how we function in the real physical world.
Right.
And so these consequences in principle can be measured in the real world. And because they can be measured in the real world, it makes the hypothesis a scientific one. Right. It really does. You can scream and say, no, it's metaphysical, it's religious. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter how you call it. What matters is the nature of the claim. Incidentally, the same thing is true of some versions of God. Right? If you think that God is some entity that can intervene in the world, perform miracles and everything, then what you're saying essentially is that there ought to be manifestations of the workings of God in nature. Well, okay, then that means we can actually look around and find them. Of course, people can make stories that God doesn't want to be tested. And, well, okay, yeah, if we play those games, then I can make you believe in invisible dragons on my shoulder and so on and so forth. So that it's not really good reasoning. But that's why the soul, again, if we define it the way we have a few moments ago, immaterial, psychologically potent, and immortal, well, that's a scientific claim. And we have known for a long time now how to evaluate scientific hypotheses. Right. And when we do that, it turns out that There's really nothing there. And so it leads scientists. By the way, just you said the book was controversial, and I agree with you. It's controversial, but it's not controversial within scientific circles.
Right. I'm glad
Right.
you cleared
My
that up.
colleague,
Thank you.
my colleagues in academia are not like saying, Julian, what are you saying? You're
Yeah.
crazy. They're like, of course we don't have a soul. Yeah, okay, it's controversial if you leave the scientific domain.
I said that
Yeah,
on purpose.
controversial, but
yes.
yeah, no,
I'm
but
glad
you're
you
right.
cleared that up.
You're right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad.
Yeah.
Thank you for clearing that up, because people don't. All my friends, I don't know anybody who don't believe. And see, basically, when they say they believe in the soul, they believe in the immortality, that there's something after this. That's what it boils down to, that they believe that there's some form of, well, their soul is going to live forever. They believe in that they'll never die. And that, there's another thing that they like to play lip service to physics, and they say, well, the energy. I hear this a lot of times, and they don't know anything else about science. They'll say energy, well, Maitreya, energy never dies. It can only be, it can't be destroyed nor created. It says stuff like that. And so I'm like, what do you say to people what do you say to that type of reasoning?
Sure. Yeah. Well, what you say is that life isn't a thing, it's a process. And that's an important difference. So the analogy would be to a candle. When you light up a candle, you have combustion, right? You have a little flame. Well, the flame combustion is a process, right? And if you put out the candle, then you terminate the process. Right. The flame doesn't continue to exist in some parallel universe or something. I mean, yeah, we can worry about more complicated physical stuff, but for the sake of the argument, okay, so the process has been interrupted. And yes, the energy is conserved, right? The chemical energy in the candle and so on and so forth, that's conserved. But that doesn't matter because the process is terminated. Right. So life is a process, not a thing. And so it once you die, the process is interrupted. And to be conscious, so we think, to be able to talk and everything, that process must go on. Energy that makes you up. It's true. There are laws of thermodynamics that explain that energy behaves this way or that way. That is correct. It's not a good argument to say, therefore, I'm immortal. Right. I mean, you're immortal in the sense that for example, we know that eventually we know where the stuff that makes up our bodies came from. It came from processes in the universe in large stars that died, that made up heavy elements and so on and so forth. Okay, so the matter that makes you and me up has been around for a long time. That's fine, but that doesn't really make you immortal, because you and I are we're human beings with all the rights and dignity that this entails, but we also are organized matter. Right? We're made up of matter that's organized. If you disrupt that organization and destroy it, you destroy processes that depend on that organization. And life is one of them. And so is mental level stuff. So we think. We could be wrong about this, of course.
Thanks for explaining that. Because I'm a life extensionist, and I believe that science can eventually find a way to extend the healthy lifespan. I think that when people believe in the soul and that they're already immortal, it kind of gets a little tricky. Like because they think they're gonna live somewhere else. They think that this life is a waiting room for heaven. That I feel like they don't get into the life extension. They don't support the scientists that's into trying to extend our healthy lifespan. And so this is another reason why I had you on the show, because I think that if people gave up the belief in the soul, then maybe we might have another alternative we can fight to help to support stem cells for life extension and all the other different scientists that are at the beginning stages of trying to figure out how we can extend our healthy lifespan. So I think that do you think that believing in the soul is just a cover up for the fears that people have? It has something to do with their mortality. that they have to cling to something, even though there's no scientific evidence for it. They cling to it because they have some type of existential fear of death.
Mm-hmm. There might be a grain of truth to that, but I think that the explanation for why people here and throughout history have believed in a soul is actually even more interesting than that. We can get into the details, but I think the main line of thinking is that we are creatures whose psychology is such that believing in the soul is very natural to us. So what do I mean by that? We are evolved creatures, as shocking as it may sound to some people, but we are part of the tree of life. And as every other living organism on the planet, we're part of a long process of evolution that started literally billions, about 4.5 billion years ago on the planet, roughly when life, at least we have evidence that life started. And branched out and diversified into all the wonderful species that we know. Many of them have died and gone extinct. But so we are part of the tree of life. And so part of our evolution means that we come pre-programmed in some sense with biological evolution, with a suite of mechanisms to apprehend the world. So we have to, as evolved creatures, we have to survive, and we have to make sense of the world around us, and we have to avoid being killed by predators, we have to avoid falling off cliffs, and so on and so forth, right? So nature has endowed us through evolution, broadly speaking, with a set of programs, mechanisms to make sense of different aspects of the world, the physical world, the biological world, the social world. And current thinking in cognitive science suggests that as a byproduct of these evolved mechanisms, we very naturally and very easily come to the conclusion that we must have some soul or something like that.
Oh, I know.
Right?
I got
on
you.
top of that now, right? Yeah. On top of that now, of course, we are perhaps unique in the world, in being able to understand consciously our own mortality, right? So we know that we're going to die. You and I know that eventually. I mean, unless science progresses and we can somehow upload our consciousness into a program, or we can understand aging better and delay it and reverse it and so on and so forth. But in our lifespan, you and I are likely to basically not be around anymore. And we're aware of that. We know that we're going to die. And so it's true that in some people it may, in fact, perhaps all of us, it may create some anxiety. And so now the two things of what you mentioned, the idea that maybe the soul that may come from somewhere else is useful, right? Because we say, look, yeah, okay, I know I'm going to die, but fortunately, I have a soul, and fortunately, I'll be reunited with my loved ones, and so that might be quite convenient. And I know one thing I would like to add is that it's true that for some people it's probably useful to think that, and if you think that personally and don't use those beliefs to push for certain policies or other, like against stem cell research, against abortion, whatever. If you just keep that to yourself and privately hope and wish that you are reunited with there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, if it gives you sustenance, and if it gives you, if it alleviates your fear somehow, and that's wonderful. The trouble, as you said, is once you begin to take these ideas very seriously, we have a soul, and therefore can't have an abortion because you kill a soul, can't do stem cell research because you kill a soul, can't have physician-assisted suicide because dying is an important spiritual process and only God can intervene, and so on and so forth. Then these ideas really get in the way of, as you said, of certain policies that might be helpful otherwise. There's a tension between holding these ideas to oneself and trying to act on them to push for certain policies. There's a tension there.
It's interesting that you use you were talking about evolution and how we came, as a correlation between how we hold the soul beliefs very dear, because there's an evolutionary biologist who has a specific theory on the why it's called the spirit brain, and why I can't remember the name of the author. This guy was brilliant, and I should have bought that book out. It's the old book that I have is so good, and he explains how evolution biology as a theory can explain why we hold these beliefs so dear. And I was like amazed. I wish I could remember this guy's name.
It's possibly Jesse Bering. He's someone who has written a book like that, and he's someone who thinks so. In professional circles, there are roughly two camps about the evolved nature of our mental life as they pertain to spiritual beliefs. One view is, as I mentioned to you, the byproduct view, that natural selection did not select for spiritual beliefs, but or beliefs in supernatural agents, God, souls, spirits, what have you, but that they're a byproduct of other traits and capacities that were possibly set for the course of evolution. Alternatively, there are some who think that some aspects of this were in fact selected for. So the arguments go something like this, that these beliefs so it connects the beliefs to morality and to group cohesion and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So it's so Jesse Bering wrote a book called The Belief Instinct. Maybe that's what you have in mind.
No, it wasn't.
I'm not sure. There's something else.
I wish I had. Maybe before we get off, I'll remember. It's
okay.
So good book. Let me ask you another question, because I want to get these questions off. I had these questions for a long time.
Great.
And I want other people to. Okay. Do we lose anything by giving up our soul beliefs? What's the alternative? And can you explain what materialism is? What materialism versus the people who believe in the soul? That whole dichotomy.
Okay, so let's start with materialism. So to get there, I'll briefly tell you about a perennial problem in philosophy and perhaps in science too, called mind-body problem that your viewers have probably heard about. So once we describe this, you'll see that materialism will become clear, and dualism too, and the soul and everything. So what is the mind-body problem? If we adopt a sort of casual approach and just observe who we are and everything, it looks like we're made up of matter. I have a body, I can touch it, I can bump it against things. So that's my physical self. Okay. So people have a physical component. But then at the same time, and our body is, you can cut it, you can hurt it, it's subject to gravity and so on and so forth. So, okay, it's physical. At the same time, as human beings also have a mental life, right? So we can experience a range of emotions, sensations, impressions. We have dreams, we have hopes. We also have certain powers. We can talk, we can reason. So there's something mental about us too. So the question now is, okay, we seem to have two things going on as people. Right? One is physical and the other one is mental. Okay, now the question is, how do these two things relate to each other, right? That's the mind-body problem. So now you can have different positions on this. One position is to say, well, if it appears that there's a physical part to us and there's also a mental part, then maybe that means that in reality, there exists two different substances, two different kinds of stuff, physical stuff and mental, spiritual stuff. That would be dualism, or substance dualism. There are two kinds of substances. Okay, that's one position. Now, of course, you can say, no, look, here's another position. You can say, look, the only thing that really exists is the physical stuff.
Right.
And everything else is somehow derived from the physical stuff, right? So you say, it's not true that there are two different substances. There's only one substance, matter. Right. And then the mental, somehow you have to explain in terms of properties of matter. Right. That would be materialism. And then you can flip things further. You can flip things around and say, look, what's to say that the thing that exists is really matter? You can say, no, the thing that really exists is mind stuff. And matter is an emergent property of that mind stuff. That's logically possible. And that would be something called, loosely speaking, idealism. Okay. So materialism, one way to think about materialism is that what's out there is what our scientific theories tell us is out there, you know, fundamental particles and so on and so forth. And we call that matter. And that everything else somehow must be explained eventually in terms of that matter. Right? So that's materialism. It gets more complicated, but that's roughly the idea.
Wow. Thank you for explaining that. Because I have a really brilliant friend, and we used to go back and forth. When I first got your book, I said, "Yo, did you read this, man?" And he told me that he believed we had a soul because we dreamed. And I tried to explain. He's a brilliant guy, and I tried to explain to him that my friend Eric, shout out to Eric. I tried to explain to him that just because you dream, it's not an indication that you have a soul. Can you explain that? Why there's no correlation? That's because dreams are not evidence that you have a soul.
It's simply because dreams are compatible with both. So if you had a soul, could you dream? Probably. But you could also dream if you're just a material being, and you could also dream if all there is underlyingly is some kind of spiritual thing, right? So dreams, no, are not evidence for the soul. In other words, dreams are not, although historically, I must say that there are people going thousands of years who were puzzled by dreams, as you can imagine, and who thought that there were parts of the self, aspects of the soul that literally left the body during the dream to frolic around and do whatever we do in our dreams and then come back. Okay. So your friend is not crazy. Those ideas have been around, right? Yeah. But today, modern scientists not take dreams as evidence for all, because so if you claim that we have a soul, right, part of the claim means, and if the soul is immaterial and immortal and therefore can function without the body, kind of evidence you would need is evidence of mental functioning, perception, memory, etc., when the body is not really working, right? So I'll give you an example so people can see what I mean by what could the evidence be. So when people undergo certain states and procedures, sometimes medical procedures, they report what is called out-of-body experiences, right? Where the subjective impression that you have is that yourself literally leaves your body, and then you can see yourself from a third person perspective. I never had this experience, but it must be quite compelling.
Right.
And it's real. People really report this. They're not lying. Yeah. It's been induced artificially. Okay. So some people say, look, that's evidence that I have a soul. My soul temporarily left my body. I was able to float around the room and see everything. So imagine this now. Imagine that this is what actually happened. Right? Imagine that your soul somehow could leave your body. You've seen the movie Ghost, right? For example, with right? Okay, well, that's exactly what happens in the movie, right? Okay. So imagine that your soul could temporarily leave your body, and that your body was unconscious on the bed. Your eyes were closed. You couldn't see anything. Suppose that we put on top of a closet or something a laptop computer, and that we displayed a string of numbers, a string of words, a string of symbols. in such a way that you, the physical part of you, the body that's on the bed, could not possibly see what's on the laptop. But if you had a soul floating around in the room, well, the soul is not bound by the body. It could float around the room and it could see the laptop. Now, imagine that upon regaining consciousness, the person said, you know what? While I was unconscious on my bed, my soul left my body. I could see myself. And by the way, I noticed that there was a laptop on top of the closet, and here's what was on it. And the person would then recite the words or the numbers or the symbols. Now we would have very good evidence. Of course, this would have to be done under controlled conditions. It would have to be replicated, as with all science. But if that could be done, we would have very good evidence that psychological functions, seeing, remembering, could happen outside the bounds of the body. So that would lead credence to the notion of a soul. But we don't have much evidence, you see. So dreams don't do it, but that, if it was possible, if we had such evidence, would be quite compelling, in fact. It's just not there.
Yeah, and I spoke to Dr. Rick Strassman. Have you heard of him?
No, I don't think I have. What?
Well, if you go back to any of my videos, he's got federal grants to study a plant-based psychedelic called DMT. I can't pronounce it for some reason, but it's called, for the short version, is DMT. And we spoke about that, because I read his book also years ago, and it induces, when he injected it in people had hallucinations, like they had out-of-body experiences. And his theory is that before death, because the body can make DMT also in the brain, that people have these DMT experiences. And he injected DMT inside people, and I thought that was extremely interesting.
It is, you're right. Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, and there's research that looks at people who have near-death experiences or out-of-body experiences describe the experience. People who are on the DMT trip describe the experience. You can't tell them apart.
Yeah.
So it's very much the same thing. But you see, so circling back to materialism, right? Mm-hmm. If materialism is true, if the experiences that we have are somehow caused or affected by the neurochemistry of our brain, it's not surprising that when you give people those powerful hallucinogenics that they start to really, you see it. We drink a lot of alcohol and already our mental states is affected. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting.
And the idea that the brain produces a chemical that the Amazon people were giving each other, the shamans were giving each other all this time, and that the brain that produces it. He said there's even more evidence today that the brain produces even more DMT than he expected. So I was like, wow. And okay, let me go to some more questions. This is very interesting.
Sure.
Oh, do you think does strong theistic beliefs in the soul lead to a more healthy society to you?
I don't think the evidence is there. I mean, so let's take. There's a very interesting way to look at this, right? So take the United States, for example. The United States has been, at least since the end of the Second World War, compared to Western Europe, an unusually religious country, given how wealthy we are, right? So in the so-called First World, since the end of World War II, there's been a wave of, so Western Europe, those kinds of places, there's been a wave of secularization. So religiosity is declined, not in the US.
Yeah.
We can go into why, so it's interesting. So the U.S. is a very pro-religious nation. You see it in our politics, right? Yes. So you can't have a national politician in the U.S. running for president, not declare, that they believe in God and faith matters and so on, even if that's not true, right? It's Remember when Bernie Sanders was running in 2016, of course, in 2020, in 2016, the Democrats were trying to paint him as an atheist, and that's supposed to be bad. That tells you something about the level of religiosity.
Yeah.
Okay, so the U.S. is very religious, and there are countries, like in Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, where religiosity is much, much, much lower. Okay, we can ask the following question. How healthy are those societies? And there are measures of health of societies. There's something called the Human Development Index, for example, that the UN uses every year. And it measures access to healthcare, life expectancy, quality of education, and so on and so forth. The U.S. is terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is the only first world country that doesn't guarantee healthcare to its citizens. You're a black man. I mean, you know the history, of course, of what happened to black people in the U.S. and still is happening. The pandemic has affected minorities disproportionately. So I think that I'm American too. I became a citizen years ago, but I think we have to be, before we scream USA, USA, we have to be humble about society. It's not great. There are great things about the U.S., but there are also horrible things about our economic system is perverse. There's all kinds of problems. So if hyper-religiosity was the cure to everything, you would see that the U.S. would be a little healthier. So I think, but now there's another aspect to your question, which is that there have been studies that have looked at in the U.S. that have looked at religiosity, right? So variations in religion, because it still varies within people, right? And things like life expectancy, measures of well-being, and so on and so forth. And these studies said, look, these things correlate. Okay, but here's the key question now. When you have religiosity, when you have people who say, I believe in God and everything, so you have beliefs, but you also have structure to belong to a church, groups of friends, support networks, and everything. So the question now is this: is it the belief part that makes you healthier, live longer, happier, or is it the networking, social networking part? And the research seems to point to the latter. It seems to be the networking part. So, support groups and so on and so forth. That and so the belief part, there's not much evidence that it leads to happier lives and so on. In fact, if you look at the research in the Scandinavian countries, it's the other way around.
Right.
Most people aren't religious, and it's those people that do better. The religious ones in the minority are the ones that do not as well in terms of those kinds of measures. So I would say that there's not much evidence that the beliefs themselves are the things that make people happier, live longer. Of course, it makes perfect sense that if I'm isolated and I don't have friends, I don't have a network, group of people that can help me. Yeah, if I have, life isn't not gonna be as nice.
Yeah, so we're social animals, most definitely.
We're social animals. Exactly. We need each other. Exactly right. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for explaining that. And I say that to people, they look at me, and I just say, go read his book. You'll get some more. Go get Dr. Musolino's book, and you'll definitely come to your own conclusions. So did you ever meet Victor Stinger personally?
We never got to meet. No, we corresponded over email over a number of years, because we had in common intellectual interest. And I asked him Soul Fallacy if he'd be willing to write the foreword for it, and he very kindly accepted. He was a lovely guy. I sent him a draft of the manuscript when I was working on it, and he sent me comments and edits on each of the chapters. He was very, very nice guy.
Yeah.
But no, I never got to meet him personally.
Rest in peace to Victor Stinger.
That's right.
Another reason why I wanted to do this because we have a great hip hopper. His name is Rakim. He's like one of our best hip hoppers in the culture, and he had a hit smash called "I Got Soul." And no disrespect, no disrespect, Rakim. I love you, but you know we have to show you the other side of things because you know the culture's getting older. We need we need to the culture needs to rest on science. You know that song was great for its time, but this is the alternative, Rakim, and I hope you get to see this. Actually, I would love to introduce you to him. I would love to get both of you up to talk and play that song and let you and play that song. I wish I could set that up. I'm gonna try to do that too.
Look, reach out to him, and
yeah, I'll reach out to him. I want to have him back, and
I'll come back on
play
the song. And I'd love to listen to the song. I can't say my knowledge of hip hop and rap is very limited, as you can imagine, but I enjoy it. So sure.
That'll be even. I'm even more happy that you didn't hear it, so you can hear it for the first time with him.
Yeah, I'd love to. I
would love to do that. And he probably, you know, he's an older guy now. He has much more experience. He's brilliant, by the way. He has much more experience behind him, and you know, I've heard him say on one of the shows, you know, because I'm paying attention, and it was a Canadian website, and they asked him, "What are you afraid of?" He said, "Death," and so. Now you can kind of, you know, the I got soul, and then he said he was afraid of death. That was his greatest fear. We need to talk, Rakim. We need to talk. I want to bring you on the show. I love you. I want to bring you on the show, and I want to introduce you to Dr.Julien Musolino. I got some other questions. Hold on. Let's see.
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead.
The ether. In the 19th century, they always argued about the ether, and Another rapper has a song called Nas. Nas is one of our. It's like Nas and Rakim. They're like Nas is Rakim's predecessor. He studied Rakim, and Rakim came out with the song "I Got Soul." Nas came out with a song to this Jay-Z called "The Ether." Can we go over the significance of the ether and the arguments of the ether in the 19th century between scientists and philosophers?
Well, this was mostly scientists. I mean, mostly physicists who. I'm not a professional physicist, so but I've read about this. I can tell you a bit about history, and if you can ask a professional physicist, and they'll tell you more about it. But the idea was that so we know, for example, that sound travels in the air as a train of compression waves, right? So it's compression waves, and sound needs a medium to travel, right? So you need an atmosphere, for example, for sound to travel. So the idea that physicists had at the time is once they started to think about light as electromagnetic waves, the question was, okay, what's the medium through which electromagnetic waves travel? And by analogy to sound, the idea was, well, look, there has to be some kind of all-encompassing medium called the ether. And so there was an ether, so they thought. And you know, physical theory developed and so on and so forth, and they tried to test the predictions. There was some complex predictions about the speed of light, the rotation of the Earth and everything, and there was a famous experiment that was done. And what came back was what's called a null hypothesis, not the result that you would expect. Okay, and that was a problem. It's like, okay, well, you know, and then the ether got more and more complicated. When Albert Einstein developed his theories of relativity in 1905 and 1915, that kind of the problem sort of evaporated. So the ether was abandoned because now physicists could understand the light phenomena and so on and so forth. Again, ask the physicist for the details, not me. But that's the story. The story is that the ether was something that was believed to exist and believed to be needed in physical theories, but that was then abandoned as physicists made progress in their understanding of certain aspects of nature. The ether is not the only thing that was believed. You may have the phlogiston, for example, which was another substance that was supposed to exist. Or so when biologists in the 19th century were interested in life, right? So what makes something alive? There was something called vitalism,
I was gonna get
and
to
the
that.
idea, right,
Yeah.
you're gonna get there, right? The idea was, look, you can't explain life in purely physical terms. You have to invoke some kind of vital force or fluid, and that was vitalism. But okay, that was there for a while. But then once understanding got deeper, there was no need for this vital force, and it was basically abandoned. So now modern biologists are not vitalists anymore. Vitalism is dead. So it does happen in the history of science sometimes that people, scientists in some discipline or other, postulate something that they think is needed, and then it turns out that understand more that thing is not there anymore and it's abandoned. That does happen. Yeah.
Um, you know what? I'm gonna tell you, I really think there needs to be a documentary or something around this because you need a visual we need visual aspects. We need to talk to a bunch of panel of scientists. I can imagine a bunch of panel of scientists and hip hoppers who still hold these beliefs, and to have a documentary around this would be awesome, man. I'm telling you because I really when I speak to my people and during my travels, so many people hold these beliefs and they never question. They never even bring it up unless something happens. You know what I'm saying? Something happens to their family members, and then they start. Somebody dies, and then they start questioning your belief. That's what happened to me. I had my aunt who was very dear, loving aunt. My aunt Joyce, she passed away, and then my father got Parkinson's, and then I said, you know what? I held these ideas all my life. I said I'm gonna get some opposite books. I'm gonna talk to some other people, get some opposite books, and try to challenge my beliefs and see if the beliefs are strong, they'll hold up. If they're not strong and they rest on pudding, then they're gonna be let go. They're gonna be let go.
That's kudos to you. That's very impressive.
Yeah.
That's the way to go. And kudos to you for challenging yourself, going out of your comfort zone, especially in the context of the death of loved ones, and going out of your way to read things that might change your mind, and apparently it did, right?
Oh yeah, and this is one of them. I'm gonna show the book before. This is a great book. This is gonna be a classic for a long time. This book, The Soul Fallacy. I'm gonna leave a description on where you could buy it. If do you have anything you would like to say before we head out? Anything to my listeners, to these future scientists out there that might go in the same direction you might go in? Do you have any things you would like to say before we head out?
Well, I want to thank them, first of all, whoever's going to listen to this and listen to us. I want to thank them for their interest. I'm part of what I do now, at least in the public sphere, is just that, talking to interesting people like you and reaching out to a broader audience. So I'm always super interested and delighted to have those kinds of conversations. So I wish that I could interact with some of these viewers and maybe answer questions and stuff like that. That would be fantastic. And I want to thank you for reaching out to me. We live in seemingly very different spheres, right?
Yes.
I like I said, I'm not much of a hip hop person myself, but you seem to be. You seem to be. You're a hip hopper yourself. Like
Definitely.
You sing, you perform music and stuff like that.
I rap also. I MC, but hip hop is more than just what we do. That's part of my culture. You see the graph on the wall. So I really live the lifestyle, the healthy lifestyle part of it, the healthy culture part of it, not what you see on the TV. And I'm trying to build the bridge between science and hip hop. And I want to. Part of my work is to help to maybe influence some young people out there who live the lifestyle hip hop and say I'm a scientist too, not just an MC, but say I'm a hip hopper. I live the lifestyle, but I'm a scientist too. That's what I would like to see.
I think this is absolutely fantastic. I mean, what you're doing is really wonderful, and I could not agree more with you about the importance of science and critical thinking and everything. So yeah, that's wonderful. That's really great. I never thought of that connection between hip hop and science until you reached out to me, and I didn't know somebody was involved in it. This is great. So
Yeah.
this is fantastic. This is fantastic.
Well, you have a great evening. This is Superlongevity Institute. I'm Laura Maitreya. He's Dr. Julien Musolino. We out. One love, everyone.